Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and I'm here to do the Springathon Poetry Challenge as created by Roz over at Scallydandling About the Books. So Springathon is a read-along celebrating the coming of spring created by Juliana, Natalie and Emma. I will link to their channels down in the description as well as to Roz's channel. And the idea of the Springathon Poetry Challenge is that you can complete Springathon sort of in miniature and just read some nature-based poems, and you'll have done the essence of the challenges. Although obviously, ideally, you then also read maybe a little bit more. I was hoping to film this in the garden today because I thought, spring, nature, plants, garden, it all made sense. One of my poems is about a garden as well. But unfortunately, today is one of the few grey days that we're having this spring, but I've got to do it today because it's Tag Tuesday and it's the Tuesday that's in Springathon. So yeah, it just had to be today. So I thought, why not just bring hitting my houseplants there, bring the greenery into the filming space rather than bringing the filming space into the greenery. So I've got some of my houseplants around me to just add some colour to the screen. So I'm hoping not to go on for too long, but I'm going to talk about like 10 or 11 poems, so with that number of poems it's inevitable that I'm going to ramble a little bit. So what Roz has done is she has picked 5 poems that she wanted us to read and to comment on, and then invited us to pick our own poems to then also answer the prompts. And I don't think she realised that was just opening like a whole world of poems, because if we all pick another 5 poems, we're just going to end up with hundreds and hundreds. But that is a good thing, because then we'll all be reading more lovely poems about nature. Struggling to say that word today. So I've got some books here. I've also got some poems that I only have online. So I've got my laptop here, so I'm sorry if I'm kind of dotting around a little bit, but I'm going to try and plunge in and not ramble for too long. So, the first thing that I would say as well is that Roz asked us to match each poem to a prompt, or find a poem for each prompt rather. But what I found was, when I went to poems that I was thinking of matching one prompt, I found that they generally matched at least one other prompt. So I noticed, and even in Roz's poems as well, the ones that she picked out, most of these poems are versatile when it comes to which prompt you could put them to. Like, it might be about a plant, but it will also mention an animal, or it might be about water, but it will also mention like trees or something. So almost all of the poems that I was picking out were versatile for these prompts, which I found nice. So the first prompt is a bird, so you have to have a poem about a bird, and Roz picked a lovely short poem by John Clare called The Thrush's Nest, and as she says, it's really just a beautifully happy descriptive poem about him watching a thrush's nest and, being happy about thrushes. But I picked a poem that had a little bit more of a story. So I picked one from the Oxford Book of Ballads, and these are ballads that were collected by various Victorian gentlemen going out and talking to people in the countryside about what ballads they like to sing to celebrate things. This volume was published in 1927, but it's dedicated to Francis James Child, Frederick James Furnivall and John Weasley Hales. I think they were all mostly Victorian. And the poem that I have picked, and I really just picked this by reading down the titles list until I found one that mentioned birds, and then I read through the ones that mentioned birds and picked out my favourite one. So this poem is The Gay Goshawk, and I meant to bring up a picture of a goshawk, but I forgot. Maybe I'll use it as the thumbnail. So, typically an English ballad will tell a story, and the story of this poem is that there is a young girl and her lover, and they are separated. The lover is in Scotland and the young girl is in England. When I say young girl, young woman I mean. And she and he are communicating via the gay goshawk, and this is, because it's a folk ballad and things can be slightly magical, this is a talking bird, and this talking bird carries letters from one to the other and helps the young woman to hatch a plan to be reunited with her lover. So she begins to get ill, unfortunately. Folk ballads tend to have a quite high mortality rate, and she starts to, you know, waste away because she's pining for her love. And she tells her dad, you know, it's really important to me that when I die, I'm buried in Scotland. And, you know, the first church that you come to, you have to do this, and the second church that you come to, you have to do that, and my brothers are going to carry me along. And she sets out all of these things that have to happen when she dies. And then the night falls, and life ebbs away from her, and she is, I think it's as dead as any lady could ever be. Yeah, but thought she was as surely dead as only lady could be, tragically. So her brothers set out to comply with her final wishes, and they pick up her bier and they carry it from one church to the next until they get to Scotland, and they get to this church where her true love is waiting for her, and he, you know, tragically goes to see her thinking that she's dead, and she's actually not dead. It's all a trick, and she jumps up, and because they're in Scotland, they're allowed to get married. So yeah, problem solved thanks to the gay goshawk. So yeah, I thought that was a really cute little poem for the prompt of bird. And the next prompt, moving on, is Water, for which Roz has chosen A Short Story of Falling by Alice Oswald, which is a poem that I've read relatively recently because I've just been reading Alice Oswald's collection Falling Awake, and this poem is from that. I have to say, it's not my favourite of the poems that she talks about water in. There's another one that I probably would have picked first, which imagines the experience of a raindrop falling to the ground. But this one is definitely a nice poem. I just felt like it was less bewitching, like it drew me in less, because the one about the falling raindrop had a lot of momentum behind it, whereas this one's more kind of thoughtful and speculative. So I have chosen something completely different again for my water poem. I have chosen another romantic poem. I'm obviously in a romantic mood today, and it is Love's Philosophy by Percy Shelley. It's quite short, so I'm just going to read it out to you. And it was one of my favourite poems when I was a teenager, when I was like 14 or 15. I remember reading it aloud to my first ever boyfriend because, you know, I thought it was really cute. Nowadays, I think it's got a slightly pushy air to it that maybe sits a little bit less comfortably with me, because it's quite demanding in a way, but you'll see if I read it to you. So, Love's Philosophy. The fountains mingle with the river, and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single, all things by a law divine, in one spirit meet and mingle. Why not I with thine? See the mountains kiss high heaven, and the waves clasp one another. No sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother. And the sunlight clasps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What is all this sweet work worth, if thou kiss not me? So yeah, a little bit plaintive and demanding, like, oh, please kiss me. But yeah, I have always thought it was quite sweet. And yeah, there's a lot of water imagery in terms of like the mixing of water and so on. And yes, you could definitely read some other stuff into that, but this is, you know, a PG video, so we're going to move on from that idea. So the next prompt, going back to Roz's little list, is Animal. And Roz chose a poem called The Trout by Seamus Heaney, and she says that she thinks that the other meaning, the second layer of meaning, is relatively obvious. So she talks about this poem being a poem about a trout, but also a poem about the sort of the Irish struggles and the difficulties around Ireland, which she knows about because she knows more about Heaney than I do. Seamus Heaney is a well-known modern Irish poet. I don't really know that much about him, and I don't really know that much, sadly, about Ireland, so I would never have made that connection. I did see the kind of militaristic metaphors that are used about the trout, but I kind of thought that it was more, he was portraying this natural being as a very brutal predator, which is interesting in itself, and I enjoyed that idea of the trout as being this like really like ruthlessly efficient, almost mechanical predator, as opposed to just like a pretty little fish. But yeah, I didn't really get the second meaning, whereas the next poem, which is for flowers, which I will get on to later, or plants, she said that the meaning underneath was not very obvious, but I found it relatively obvious to me. So I found that interesting that we had different ways of interpreting those. But yeah, so my poem for Animal I have picked another poem with a bit of a story to it. So I've picked from Tales from Ovid. Ros said that she thought that Steve Donahue might use all poems from Ovid to fill this out, but I thought of that. I thought of using this poem when I'd forgotten that she'd said that. I promise it was my own idea. So this is Ted Hughes's adaptation and translation of Ovid's poems, and the poem that I've chosen for Animal is Actaeon. So Actaeon is a Greek myth in which a hunter with a pack of hounds is just finishing up his day's hunt when he accidentally sees the goddess Diana in her grotto in the woods, and she curses him and turns him into a deer, into a stag, because nobody is allowed to see her naked, and she was naked because she was having a bath. Again, this is water and animals at the same time. And she turns him into a stag, and then his own hounds chase him and devour him. And I particularly like the period in which he is transforming from a human into an animal. That was all she said, but as she said it, out of his forehead burst a rack of antlers. His neck lengthened, narrowed, and his ears folded to whiskery points. His hands were hooves, his arms long slender legs. His hunter's tunic slid from his dappled hide. With all this, the goddess poured a shocking stream of panic terror through his heart like blood. Actaeon bounded out across the cave's pool in plunging leaps, amazed at his own lightness. And there, clear in the bulging mirror of his bow wave, he glimpsed his antlered head and cried, "What has happened to me?" No words came, no sound came, but a groan. Yeah, so I find that really dramatic and interesting, and yeah, it's just a really good, powerful, emotive telling of the story and the moment of transformation. And if you know Metamorphosis, you know that a lot of these poems deal with ideas of transformation and the kind of the human-animal divide and boundaries kind of thing. So, next is Plant, and like I said, Roz picked a poem called Daisies by Kathleen Jamie. So Daisies is a poem about the moment at which daisies close their petals together at night time. And Roz said that it was a really pretty poem, but she felt like it had a second meaning, but she wasn't sure what or where that second meaning was. I think it's really quite obvious, because at the end of the poem, Jamie says, let me find it, that as the daisies close, and eventually at the end of their lives they die, never knowing what they miss in the time when they are closed. So to me what that says is that she is saying that they are pretty and innocent, but they are hiding from the dark, and by hiding from the dark they are inevitably missing out on something. And I think she's suggesting to humans as well as to daisies that possibly it's worth staying open to things that are scary at times and sort of seeing what there might be, and if there's something there that maybe isn't so scary or could be worse, and rather than just saying, oh, I'm exhausted, it's time to curl up, maybe every now and then staying open to the experiment of staying out in the dark or in any other sort of unknown area. So that was my interpretation of Kathleen Jamie's poem. I thought it was another pretty sweet nature poem. And the poem that I have chosen for Plant is a little bit less pretty and a little bit less sweet. And it is a Victorian poem by, I'm going to have to tell you his full name because it's a brilliant Victorian name. I've lost my tab. Algernon Charles Swinburne. So Algernon Charles Swinburne wrote a poem in 1878 called A Forsaken Garden. Swinburne is one of those poems who was really famous to the Victorians and the Edwardians, and he's referenced in the Vera Brittain book that I'm reading at the moment, and he's referenced in other Victorian authors refer to him, but other Victorian poets are much better known now than Swinburne, even though he was quite respected at the time, I believe, as far as I can tell. So yeah, if you counted the number of people who can name Tennyson versus the number of people who can name Swinburne, there would be quite some disparity there. But he was kind of from the school of Tennyson, and the poem A Forsaken Garden is in many ways kind of a response to Tennyson's own writing about grief in terms of his In Memoriam poem, from what I can understand from the very handy introduction that the Victorian Poetry Anthology provides. So A Forsaken Garden as you might expect, is about a forsaken garden, and it's about a little patch of garden between the cliffs and the sea that has been neglected, and he speculates about what might have happened in that garden before it was neglected. So he imagines a pair of lovers promising eternal love to one another, and just ruminates on the fact that, you know, they made such promises, but they are, you know, gone effectively. And the poem continues towards the conclusion of an imagined end of all things. That's sort of not exactly an apocalypse in the dramatic sense, but, you know, like an end of days, in that way, where the death that was experienced by the lovers in itself is dead. So there is a recurring metaphor of a rose, where the beautiful part of the rose has faded, but the thorns remain, is mentioned in one part, but the rose kind of recurs as an image throughout the poem, as also does the power of the sea, and the sea like kind of crashing alongside the garden. So again, it's that blend of different natural elements within one poem. So the poem is 10 stanzas long, and I just wanted to read one of them for you, just so that you can see how beautifully Swinburne can construct a poem. So this is stanza 8. All are at one now, roses and lovers, not known of the cliffs and the fields and the sea. Not a breath of the time that has been hovers in the air now soft with the summer to be. Not a breath shall there sweeten the seasons hereafter of the flowers or the lovers that laugh now or weep, when as they that are free now of weeping and laughter, we shall sleep. Yeah, I just particularly like that one of the stanzas. So that was Plant. And then the next prompt is travel or destination. And here I've got a classic one for fitting into two categories, because I've chosen Night Flight from Muncaster by Joe Shapcott. Unfortunately, I know that I love this poem, and I read it a long time ago, and I really, really loved it then. I read it because of an English literature thing that we had to do, where we had to read a poem and then write an interpretation of it. But I can't find the full text of it anywhere online. I can find reviews of it, I can find sort of information about the author, I can find the first couple of lines, but I can't find the full text. But essentially, Shapcott asks the reader, or she doesn't ask the reader, she tells the reader to become an owl and experience what it is like to be an owl, and travel as an owl in flight through the night, as you might be able to tell from the title. And I just found it so evocative and so inspirational. And I think the interpretation that I wrote of it was that the owl was a metaphor for the poet on a journey to write a poem, and I found all bits of evidence in the poem for it, but it worked. Yeah, it's just a poem that really carries you on a journey and believably makes you see the world from the eyes of an owl, and taking this journey. So I thought it fitted perfectly for the theme of travel. Roz instead picked A Day in Sussex by Wilfred Scowen Blunt, which is a poem that I found beautiful but quite dark. So he talks about, you know, escaping and going and lying in the countryside and you know, hearing the animals around him and so on. But throughout that, there's lots of references to kind of negative stuff. So he talks about how the world has troubled him, and when he escapes into Sussex, it is an escape from grief. He actually says I can't grieve in this natural place. But he also associates that escape from grief with a form of deception. So it's almost like his experience of being out in the natural world is tied to an experience of feeling like this kind of Eden that he's found is not real, and it's not the life that he is living for the most part. So I thought it was perhaps a little bit darker than Roz suggested before I'd read it. I thought it was going to be kind of quite light-hearted, but actually it sounds like there's a story there, and the story is bad things that are being eased temporarily by the presence of nature. So I feel like I'm really taking a long time over this. The next challenge is to read a work of non-fiction. Roz has suggested that The Thrush's Nest fits the bill, but I think all of the poems that I have chosen are not factual. I think, so Roz was saying a poem can be fiction or non-fiction, but just running through what I've had a story about a talking bird, a boy begging to be kissed, or, you know, I'm saying boy because the poet was a boy, a man transforming into a stag, a decaying garden, and a person becoming an owl. So I don't think any of them really count as non-fiction. But thinking about the idea of non-fiction is the idea of truth, of writing about truth. And one thing that a poem can do is it can access in a condensed way a broader truth and kind of like summarize an idea that is always real but crystallizes into a poem. I don't know that I've expressed that very well, but like a poem can kind of bring an idea together. And to do that, I have chosen a poem by AE Housman from A Shropshire Lad, and he wrote a lot of what I would probably describe as non-fiction poems about sort of Shropshire and things around Shropshire. Definitely a lot of his poems would fit into travel and destination, and a lot of them have references to nature. This one definitely fits for plant as well, but it's very short and it's very nice, and I think it's a sentiment that we can take with us for lockdown, because he talks about just basically the need to make the most of the short time that you have in nature. And you know, we've been dealing with only being allowed outside for an hour a day. That has been extended, but the limitation of your time versus the need to sort of make the most of that time, I suppose. So, loveliest of trees, the cherry now is hung with bloom along the bough, and stands about the woodland ride, wearing white for Eastertide. Now of my 80 years and 10, 20 will not come again, and take from 70 springs a score. It only leaves me 50 more, and since to look on things in bloom 50 springs a little room, about the woodlands I will go, to see the cherries hung with snow. So yeah, so that's the end. And that's just a little poem about, you know, making the most of the time that you have, and the beautiful things that there are in life. And yeah, I feel like I said, that's something that we can embrace at the moment. So this has been a delight. I have a couple of people that I would like to tag, I haven't written here. I've written on a piece of paper that I've left downstairs. Interesting. So, from memory, I was going to tag Alba from Seriella, because I saw that she commented on Roz's video that she would be interested in trying it, and I don't believe that Roz tagged her. I would like to tag Matthew from, I think it's Mayberry Book Club, because he's been doing a project recently where he has been reading the Norton anthology, and I thought it would be really interesting if he could pick 5 sort of Middle English poems to talk about to fit these themes. And I'm going to tag, I think his name is Alan from the Book Traveller. I'll send him a message to say that I've tagged him in case I've got his name wrong, because I looked back and I saw that he did the Poetry Tube movie tag, and I don't think I have ever tagged him for anything, and you know, I thought it would be nice. And yeah, I think that's everyone that I was going to tag. Anyway, I hope you're all well. I hope you're all enjoying the spring, grey days or not grey days, and yeah, and making the most of things, and enjoy the poetry, and I would like to see more people participating in this one. And yeah, thanks to the hosts of Springathon for, you know, hosting the whole thing. Take care.